She had every reason to run. The house smelled of cedar and of being chosen. Brass lamps threw a steady amber that made her skin look like an investment. Billy had wrapped the place for her the way the city's social circuits wrapped each other. A careful gift, a public sign. He had a way of entering rooms as if he had rehearsed the applause that would follow, and Julia, who had spent a life arranging herself to receive attention, felt a private shiver when he put the cedar box on the mantel and pressed his palm to its lid as if sealing a promise. The cedar was the first pledge, not perfume exactly, but an old wood warmth under everything, an insinuation that things in the house remembered hands. The gray button lay inside, tiny as a coin, its surface dull and cool. Billy said it had belonged to a tailor who kept things by color. He smiled when he told her, the kind of smile that implied histories he never fully explained, and invitations she accepted. He called her his chosen. Guests called her lucky. Photographers called her presence decisive. On social pages, she was elegance in motion, an arm here, a laugh there, a photograph that suggested a life delicately curated. The house, furnished in measured taste, became a public image as much as a private refuge. That first morning, she woke with her cheek pressed to the pillow, the cedar inside the room like a held note. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city was a grayed watercolor of taxis and glass. On the coffee table, a brass lamp with a slender stem held a small camera in its neck, one of Billy's afterthoughts. He liked to talk about security aesthetics, as if he were naming a perfume line. Julia flicked on the lamp to read, the film of light making the ash on her bedside table look picturesque. She must have hit the camera's test feed because later, when she skimmed the footage to see how the house looked at dawn, the image stopped on a frame where the seam of the sofa, the seam directly under which she had tucked her feet, was a clean white square. The first real strange thing was small and precisely surgical, a square of light that wasn't light so much as blankness. Everything around it read as texture, fabric weave, the hairline shadow cast by the lamp, except that exact rectangle where the camera recorded nothing, an absence that read like a censored word. The time code registered exactly 0 waller 0. 17:08. The camera stopped at 17 seconds and 8 frames. Julia rewound and watched again. The white patch sat like a confession. She told herself it was a sensor fault, a corrupted pixel. Billy told her to let the technicians handle it. Friends laughed about it over champagne, the city's small, courteous scoffs that folded the extraordinary into wit. But the cedar clung to memory in a way that jokes could not displace. The box she kept on the mantel moved by the third day, not far, not dramatic, perched now on a lower shelf as if to be noticed afresh. The gray button was never misplaced, only relocated in the house, always within sight. When she looked at it, her fingers found the button and the wood, and the palm accepted the press of both as proof that things belonged to her. At parties, she learned to present the cedar house as if it were an accessory, a room with character, a domestic sculpture with a tidy provenance. She used it to display that she had been chosen, and that choice was, in the city, a currency. If you want the next chapter of how proof and perception braid together, keep watching. The technicians came with polite competency. They were men and women who could make any mechanical mean something human. One wore a soft cardigan and called her Miss Calder, as if gentility would clarify a blank. They pulled cables, ran diagnostics, removed the lamp's camera, and fed its chip into a small box that hummed like a satisfied insect. They told her, carefully, that modern sensors sometimes failed in ways that mimicked intention. The footage they returned was relentless in its neutrality. Broken pixels, artifacts, a consistent white at 17 seconds and 8 frames. They shrugged and offered replacements. The new cameras performed the same. The white reclamation held. Julia did not accept shrugging. She kept her face for parties, but alone she began to chart. She wrote down the timestamps in a steady, deliberate hand and boxed them on her pad. She taped the gray button to a page and wrote cedar next to it, as if labels could anchor reality. A list formed the way the city had taught her to make commitments, a list that read like liturgy. The house, for all its curated calm, had become a laboratory. Kem arrived the week after the lamp camera declared itself untrustworthy. He had been a friend since the smaller days, when Julia's name meant cleverness at auctions and a good eye for prints rather than any social dominion, and he brought with him the kind of certainty that is not relief, but a working method. He looked at the white square and did not smile. He asked for the original memory card, for the lamp now in pieces on the mantel, for her permission to bring in analog equipment. Polaroids, a Super 8, a spool of magnetic tape meant for old projectors, and a set of pressure sensors that could be slipped under fabric. Analog holds, he said simply, clipping the ends of a sentence like a pivot. Digital forgets in predictable ways now. We try the other first. She watched him arrange the room like a surgeon placing instruments. There was an economy to his motion. The camera that fit into a Polaroid's hollow, the Super 8 threaded through a slim metal gate, the tape unspooling with a soft, almost respectful whir. He taped a pressure pad beneath the sofa, where the seam made a thin valley. He stuck a tiny hygrometer behind the molding and draped a cloth over a small lamp to make a soft, even light source. He labeled everything with dates and a shorthand that made sense only to those who practiced this sort of faith. They filmed that night, analog, slow, deliberate. The Super 8 clicked and sighed. The Polaroid spat a square that drank at the room's light and then slowly revealed its secret. When the Polaroid developed in Kem's hands, the usual image of sofa and lamp came into view. But a faint ripple, a shimmering like oil over steel, ran along the seam. Not a white void this time, but a texture in the image that echoed the way cedar slid along air. Insinuating, not loud. The pressure pad registered a soft, repeated increase in mass beneath the sofa. Not enough to be a person standing, Kem said. Too precise to be the house settling. Something is pressing, he translated, and his voice did not have room for metaphor. Julia began to feel observed by the thing before she knew whether it was watching. In the small hours, she found herself listening for the house's breath, the low settling noise of radiators, the far hum of traffic, and, sometimes in the empty places between breaths, an almost inaudible rasp, the sound a spool might make when something passes close enough to disturb it. The cedar was a companion and a sign. When she lay under the duvet, its scent rose like an invitation and a compass. She began to rub a little cedar shaving on her wrist, anointing herself in protocol, and at the same time her fingers would brush the gray button in her pocket and feel the coldness of the thing like a private charm. At a gallery opening 2 weeks later, she stood buffed and composed in the glare of backstage lights. Billy arrived with the sort of uneffusive pride that became his public language. He moved among guests with measured kindness and with a politeness that made no claims to intimate knowledge. Reporters liked him. He was photographed alongside patrons, and his eyes on her were different in the photographs, softer by an inch, as if he knew the precise economies of reserve. People asked after the cedar house in the intervals of conversation. Julia made small jokes, shared curated details, deflected with the practiced ease of someone who had sold stories about herself for so long she could do it in her sleep. Later that night, a blogger uploaded a photo in which the seam of a sofa in the gallery, no relation to Julia's house, contained a conspicuous white square. Comments scrolled with amusement, and a few earnest speculations about camera glitches. The city's gaze nibbled at anomaly and swallowed it, because scandal needs appetite, and the public prefers its mysteries digestible and boxed. But for Julia, each of these white squares in other people's pictures arranged themselves like a map. She saw an aligning pattern. She felt less like an anomaly and more like a node in whatever geometry the blankness suggested. Billy was always measured about how much he would know. When she confronted him the way one might address a loose thread on a garment, softly, with a social smile, he smelled faintly of cedar at the neck of his coat and offered private kindness with a guarded language. It could be nothing, he said, as if nothing were a plausible explanation. He reached for her hand and his fingers cooled in contact, an effect she first blamed on his penchant for keeping his apartment a bit too cool in summer. He moved with his usual civility around the question. He offered to pay for replacements, to hire specialists, to book a private engineer. And in the face of that offer, she felt both grateful and oddly alone, the way gratitude sometimes functions like a thin veil over something more complicated. If the house had been an emblem of profession before, it had now become an experiment in domestic governance. she began to carve out rules. No one would sit on the western part of the sofa after midnight. She set the lamp to record only on manual, and she would watch the tape reels at dawn with coffee. She asked Kem to leave a spool of magnetic tape running for longer stretches. The analog methods preserved things differently. The reel, when played back in a small dark room, caught an undercurrent of noise, a soft rasp layered beneath the tick of the projector, like the sound of something sliding over scale. The Polaroids showed the seam as a slight bulge, as if some skin beneath the fabric held itself taut. She told herself she wasn't frightened. And she told herself, later, that hers was a practical mind. She had been trained to do things, purchase, curate, host, with steady hands and a rational ledger. But there were nights when rationality dissolved into something that felt personal and precarious. When an appendage slid from beneath the sofa, first a fingertip, then the length of an arm, against her calf, it did not feel like a threat so much as an exam. The skin was cool under the hide of upholstery, and against the warmth of her calf, it was a cold that read as intentional. The surface had a faint pattern, not like the scales of fish, but closer to overlapping shingles. Compact, slightly iridescent, and decisive. It rested against her ankle as if testing the world with a palmar curiosity, and the cedar smell swelled into a presence that made the room feel mapped by a single scent. She did not scream. She made a list. She had taught herself to manage perception by making lists long before any of this began. This was the ledger of self. She told herself precise sentences. Do not move the face, do not bring the face into the light, and spoke them aloud in a flat voice, training herself like an actor reciting stage directions. The appendage withdrew the first time she spoke. It did not flee so much as contract, dissipate into the seam. Later, when she watched the Super 8, the film, a forgiving, patient medium, caught only a blurring at the edge of the frame, an indistinct silver that the eye had to coax into form. The digital feeds had gone white at 17 seconds and 8 frames. The analog preserved a trace, a negative of presence that was not emptiness but a material whisper. She began to ritualize her minutes. The rituals were small and procedural, a mirror placed at an angle to catch the seam while she sat on the opposite chair, a nightlight left on at the lamp's base because the camera cut at certain lux levels, cedar shavings sprinkled in a thin ring under the sofa to mark territory. The gray button moved each night to a new point in the room and logged like a breadcrumb. She kept an inventory, the Polaroid squares, the real clicks, the pressure pad graphs with their rising bumps, pinned in a small binder labeled in her hand, house log. It was important to her that each item be cataloged, dated, and cross-referenced. The ledger functioned as sanity's architecture. Neighbors noticed oddness the way city people notice weather, as a fact of life that's amusing until it affects them. A building concierge called to say the downstairs resident had complained of a smell, cedar of all things, seeping up at 3 in the morning. A neighbor's cat began to avoid the corridor outside Julia's door. The rumor mill spun a few barbed comments in private forums. A fashion editor asked about the button as if it were a small costume piece. The social world did not collapse. Instead, it rearranged around her with the soft diligence of people making space for a new eccentricity. Billy's hospitality became tighter, more considered. He began to close the doors to certain rooms when there were guests, and he developed a language of concealment that felt like respect. Some things are just personal, he told her once, and she believed him because he brought with the sentence a gentleness she rarely got in public. He did not suggest moving. He did not suggest the house be sold. Instead, he suggested modifications. Different fabrics that would not complicate the seam, a custom cover made that would make the sofa's field uniform. When she insisted on tapes and Polaroids, he supported Kem's work with an awkward generosity, donations, contacts, logistic help, and then resumed his role as the city's proper host. Her mother called a few times. Mothers are not peer reviewers, but they speak in the bluntness of domestic economy. Her voice was a vessel of practical concern. "Why are you staying?" her mother asked over the line, a question that unpeeled debts and privileges all at once. Julia hesitated, thinking of all the times she had curated herself in order to belong. Staying meant stakes, house, reputation, and invested life. Leaving meant uprooting, abandoning social currency, saying publicly that she had misjudged a life built as carefully as a gallery. There were moments when staying felt like surrender. There were others when it felt like an assertion. In the quiet, when Billy's voice softened and he touched her shoulder with an almost tender impatience, she felt chosen. There was a warmth to the attention he gave her. He wiped a dish after she cooked, laughed at a small private joke, kept a hand steady at the small of her back in photographs. He never spoke of the appendage in a way that would strip it of mystery. Instead, he spoke of it in the grammar of an absent thing, troubles, and then changed the subject with a toast. The differential between his public polish and private hedging calibrated her intimacy. He was, in all outward ways, affectionate and discreet, and that discretion carried weight. The more she cultivated records, the more she noticed the difference between the city's appetite and the house's insistence. Cameras on the street would capture her in a black dress, and the flash would bleach details. Party photos would compress gestures into a collage of curated angles. A magazine would run a 2-page spread about the Cedar House with a caption that implied romance and numinous taste. The white squares in her camera footage found analog cousins in other people's snapshots, but the city's readers preferred allegory, mystery reframed as glamour. She was an object, sometimes lovingly, sometimes casually. The ledger, however, made her subject. There was a night when the appendage explored the space between caution and friendship. She had been sitting cross-legged on the floor, binder open, coffee cooling beside her, lamp dimmed to a reading glow. The gray button sat on the page as if it were an index. Her pen left marks in a neat hand. Without dramatic prelude, a small pressure brushed the top of her hand. It felt like breath and like stone, cool where her palm had been warm. The surface was not warm like human skin, and not cold like metal. It existed in an intentional temperature that rendered intimacy ambiguous. She said aloud, because sound seemed to rearrange boundaries, "Not the face." The touch retreated, then came again along the inside of her wrist, a patient exploration that obeyed none of the gestures of human touch. It applied pressure like inquiry rather than like threat. She learned the grammar quickly. A pause was an answer, a withdrawal, an assent. She tried to map its limits. She ran a finger along the spot where the appendage had touched and felt a residue, smell of cedar, faint and persistent. On the news, a gossip anchor spoke of her with the usual peal, "Ever the enigma, Ms. Calder." And Julia, in the lamp's pool of light, catalogued every rising and falling, not because she wanted to prove something to the world, but because lists steadied her against the erosion of amazement into spectacle. Kem began to bring other things. A small analog tape recorder, a set of contact microphones, a box of cedar shavings placed like a sacrament around the sofa's base. "It seems to react to wood," he observed, as if he were announcing a neutral pattern pulled from mountains of data. The tape, when played back, produced a layer under the recorded air. A thin rasp, almost like the sound an ancient loom might make when it shifted. It was not angry. It had no cadence of malice. It came across as patient and deliberate, as if the appendage was measuring time in a currency different from human seconds. She began to keep a private index. Polaroid 03 showed a slight silver bloom along seam. Tape 02 recorded rasp at 0.1708. She had begun to note the number as if it were a chant. Pressure log C indicated repeated micro-increases at hours coincident with her sitting. She circled the entries with a steady pen. The house, for all its beauty, had become a ledger where notes and measures accumulated into a pattern. The cedar box had become the reliquary where she stored artifacts. The Polaroids, a vial of residue scraped from the seam and sealed with wax, the gray button wrapped in a thin cloth. She handled these objects with a curator's ceremony. Each removal and replacement was an act of devotion and of testing, an experiment in the governance of intimacy. On a night when rain stitched the windows with a gentle fusillade and the city hummed like a far engine, she slept and woke with the sense of another presence near the bed. The appendage had learned to navigate the domestic as if it had been trained by long observation. It pressed to the small of her back and then withdrew in increments, like a reader underlining passages in an unhurried script. It had no hands in the human sense, rather it had a length that could curl and flex, ending in a small pad that applied pressure with a tactile intelligence. When it brushed her ear, it emitted a scent, cedar, deeper, wood smoke without flame, that felt like a code. She did not panic. Instead, she whispered carefully, "If you're going to be here, you do not touch the face." The appendage curled around her ankle then, a gesture that read like a promise or a vow. It did not try to control her. She felt a strange agency in the encounter, an agency that belonged to the fact that she refused to be a passive foil to the thing's curiosity. She braided rules and rituals from the encounter, and in doing so, fashioned a life that was uncanny and controlled by turns. She instituted the lamp protocol, tape in the Super 8, Polaroid in the pocket, a spool running on low. She placed a mirror at the exact angle that caught a sliver of seam and left it there as a check, a witness. In the morning, she would cross-reference the reel with the Polaroid and circle any minute concordances. At first, friends teased her about the cataloging. "You're making a museum out of your sofa." A bridesmaid-turned-friend laughed once at lunch. But the ledger continued to accumulate. Public life, for all its spectacle, became only a layer under the rich private labor of surveillance and ceremonies she paid herself in cedar. There were evenings when she would stand by the window as the city shimmered and think about all the lives she had curated to belong here, and she wondered whether belonging required the concession she was making. The question did not demand a single answer. It lived as a choice she would repeat every morning when she pocketed the gray button under her dress and walked into rooms that studied her as much as she enrolled them. The city kept spinning headlines in its comfortable voice, a profile of Billy's philanthropy, a glossy feature of modern interiors, a discreet column that named her new house among places to be seen. The white squares appeared elsewhere, on someone's rooftop picture, on a sidewalk photograph, and people wrote about camera errors and lighting anomalies. The analog artifacts were less interesting to the city's appetite. They did not translate easily into the flat narrative of glamour. But to Julia, they were everything. Polaroids that held shimmers, tape that remembered rasp, a pressure sensor graph that traced the appendage's patience like a heartbeat. Once, when the house felt particularly like a map unwinding, she cooked dinner for Billy and Kem. They ate on the terrace, a private island above the city, as lights winked glass-wise below. Billy talked about a new philanthropic venture, his voice full of names and networks. Kem spoke less of networks and more of the tape and a possible repeatable test. At one point, Billy reached for her hand across the table in a straightforward gesture, palm open, offering warmth. His skin was softer than she had expected, and for a second, the world simplified into a generosity she had long sought. She accepted his hand and felt in the touch an economy, a care that asked for no confession. Later, alone, she placed the gray button under the pillow and lay awake thinking about the ledger. She had chosen to remain, and in that choice, had converted love into a practice. It was not naivety. It was a mode of governance, an arrangement in which she kept the house's proofs and its secrets in equal measure. The appendage had not been explained. It had been touched, measured, and negotiated with. It had not become monstrous in any melodramatic sense. It had become present, like the cedar itself, a quality that defined a place and its terms. When she rose before dawn to review the tape, the reel clicked with the patient sound of history. She threaded it through a small projector in the dark, and the room filled with the flicker of an older medium. At Rear 1708, there was not a white void this time. The frame offered a silver bloom at the seam, a subtle distension that suggested presence without pronouncement. The audio, if one could call the rasp audio, sounded like a slow intake, something measuring the world in pressures and in cedar. She rewound and logged the entry. Reel 04, 17S8F, Polaroid 07 corresponds. Pressure rise. The ledger thickened. Her decision to make the ledger public only to a select few, Kem, a lab technician who agreed to keep notes, and one archivist friend who once handled rare negatives, was itself an act of sovereignty. She could have called the press and framed the house as a spectacle to buy time or pity, to create a narrative that the city would devour and sanitize. Instead, she kept it small. Keeping it small meant maintaining command, There was an evening when she permitted herself to be sentimental. On the mantel, in front of the cedar box, she placed an old photograph of a younger version of herself standing at a charity bash, hair pinned badly in a style that had once seemed daring. The photograph was not particularly flattering, but she liked it because it reminded her of the girl who had learned how to turn attention into access. She thought of that girl when the appendage, curious perhaps, or respectful, touched the back of her hand and left a faint residue that smelled faintly of cedar and salt. She did not flinch. She pressed her palm to the mark afterward and found, not a bruise, but a trace of texture that read in the dark like an autograph. In private, she sometimes rehearsed a confession to her mother that she never meant to send. She imagined telling the story as if it were a parable. I found something impossible and decided to govern it. I kept records. I made rules. I asked it not to touch the face. Her mother would give practical answers. Sell the place, move to the countryside, open hospital doors for normal rooms. But the ledger and the cedar and the cool pad on her skin argued otherwise. There were ways of belonging that required negotiation instead of flight. Kem returned one Thursday with a small device that looked like a human thumb turned into a microphone. He had engineered it to pick up frequencies beneath audible range. He placed it near the seam, wrapped the spool, and prescribed a silence for the week. No guests, no parties, no television. The house agreed with a low creak, like a neighbor making room for a new tenant. For days she watched the ledger fill with patterns, and the presence conformed to the rules with a patience that unnerved her. It respected the mirror angles, altered its timing to avoid the face, dated its returns to hours that did not disrupt social obligations. It behaved like a guest that knew how to be considerate. But consideration is not trust. There were nights when the thing's curiosity expanded in ways she could not predict. A longer brush at the ankle, a probe at the base of her palm, a sensation that scattered her. She would then sit with the ledger and rewrite rules, adding clauses like a lawyer stipulates terms. The list became comprehensive. No contact with face. Cedar box to remain on mantel unless in use. Polaroids to be taken from a specific height. Mirror angle to be exact to 0.07 degrees. She stapled these directives into the binder and in their physicality found relief. Rules were less a cage and more a map. Externally, nothing changed too rapidly. The city's parties continued. Billy continued to be photographed with a stoic tenderness. Julia continued to smile and occupy rooms with the grace her public demanded. But inside the house, the grammar of getting along with otherness took shape. The non-human presence did not disclose origin. It did not need to. Its signature, cedar, the 17s8F blank, the cool scale, was enough to mark its border. Julia chose, again and again, to remain inside those borders. There was a night when Billy brought a friend, a curator from an overseas gallery, to see the Cedar House. He wanted to show the space as a piece of living interior, and the curator walked carefully as if entering an installation. Julia watched from the kitchen, where she had placed a small camera set to analog. The white overhead lights had been dimmed. The living room smelled of cedar and a faint citrus Billy preferred when entertaining. When the guest's back was turned, a curl of the appendage slipped from under the sofa and grew along the baseboard like a vine seeking light. It did not touch the curator. It only noted perhaps the presence of another body. When the guest left, praising the room's palimpsest of domestic memory, Billy kissed Julia on the cheek and said, "You were right about the lighting." That evening, after the guests had left and the house had returned to its measured quiet, Julia sat with the ledger and the cedar box open. She moved the gray button in her hand as if consulting an oracle. There were costs to staying, some social, some personal, that she had accounted for, and others that surprised her. Love, she had once thought in simpler terms, was an expansive thing that lifted you. Here, love had become a negotiated project, an economy of touch, a set of protocols, a sovereign insistence that she remained the author of her days. She made a ritual before bed, one that would come to define later months. A Polaroid taken, the button placed on a linen handkerchief at the foot of the bed, cedar shavings sprinkled inside the shoes by the door, a mirror angled to catch the seam should it show itself.
She whispered the rules aloud because the sound seemed to anchor them into being, a litany of practical clauses. The appendage, somewhere in the house, answered by pattern if not by words. It retracted its curiosity from the face and accepted the margins she offered.
When she woke the next morning, there was a line of tiny indentations on the underside of the pillow where the gray button had sat. They read like a signature impressed into cloth. The Polaroid developed slowly in the kitchen, the image revealing a faint silver along the seam at exactly 17:08. She recorded the time in the ledger and closed the book with a hand that trembled only a little, the way hands tremble when someone has decided to keep a dangerous secret and make it into a life. Outside, the city demanded continuity. She dressed for a luncheon and placed the gray button in the pocket of her coat as if it were a talisman. She kissed Billy at the door and felt his hand rest for a moment at the small of her back, the gesture of someone who recognizes you as the project of their attention. She took a car through streets that glittered with midday commerce and sat at a restaurant where friends made light of cares and called her brave for being so private about something so strange. Inside, the ledger lay open, waiting for the tape, the Polaroids, the next 17S8F that would translate absence into form. When the car returned to the Cedar house that evening, the windows were dim and something about the apartment seemed to have shifted in the way an argument shifts a family photo, subtle and permanent. Kem had left a new spool of tape on the mantel with a small note, "Check temporal pattern." The gray button sat where she had left it on the mantel. The cedar box had been moved a little to the left. A careful smudge of cedar dust lay like a map. She ran her finger over the dust and felt the day's contours settle into an uneasy peace. She could make plans, open new ledgers, set new rules, but she could never fully resolve the fact that something not fully human had learned to negotiate with her skin. That knowledge altered her sense of being chosen. It made the gift Billy had given her both more sacred and more fraught. The house continued to smell of cedar. The lamp's small camera continued, when it was left to its own devices, to collapse into the blank at 17 seconds and 8 frames. The analog reels kept a patient memory. The gray button kept its coldness against her palm. On a late night in which rain beat a steady rhythm against the windows, she sat in the dark and placed the binder on her lap. She read entries like someone following a map to a site that never completed itself. There were moments of tenderness in the ledger, notations of the appendage's restraint, of its manner of retreat when she said small, controlled sentences, but also there were notes that held the rhythm of an uncanny patience. She understood that love, for her, had become an architecture. Lists, mirrors, lamps, cedar shavings, a repertory of small, precise prohibitions and permissions. She had not run. She had instead elected a careful rule of living. The choice did not feel like surrender. It felt like a rearrangement of what it meant to be sovereign. And yet, in that rearrangement, there remained space for surprise. That night, as she closed the binder and rose to put the Polaroid into the cedar box, the house made a sound like a page turning. The seam under the sofa shifted as if someone, something, had traced a line of intent beneath its fabric. She paused with the gray button between her fingers, aware that the next item she filed would be another claim in a ledger that would not resolve into neatness. She went to the mantel, drew the cedar box close, and lifted the lid. Inside, on a nest of shavings, the Polaroid lay face up. The photograph showed the seam in the customary silver bloom, but at its edge, almost lost to the light, there was a small tuft of something, tiny scales perhaps, or flakes of wood, and the faintest pattern of metallic sheen. It caught the light like an answer not yet given. She closed the lid and walked to the window. The city's lights wore on like a hem of distant constellations. In the dark, the house behind her hummed in a low, steady way, and in that hum, the cedar seemed to keep a vigil. She put the gray button into her pocket and, for a moment, allowed herself to think of Billy as more than a figure who had given her a house. She allowed the thought that he had given her a place where she could test herself. The thought sat beside her like a quiet companion. There would be investigations, more reels, nights of log-keeping, and tired mornings. There would be polite doubts from friends, and the city's appetite for narrative would press against her privacy until she learned better how to shape it. There would also be touch, that slow, tactile language the presence used, reminding her that not all intimacy is human, and that the non-human could be negotiated with, not dominated. For now, she walked through rooms she had once thought of as mere settings and recognized them as grammar, lamps creating rules, mirrors offering checks, cedar marking borderlines. She had chosen to stay, and in that staying she became both archivist and companion to something that did not belong to the world of social pages. The ledger sat on her table like a vow. She turned out the light and went to bed, the gray button warm in her palm as if it held a small, private heart. Outside, the city breathed on, indifferent and precise. Inside, the house exhaled cedar. The appendage, somewhere in the room, kept its distance as if honoring the convenance she had set. She pressed her hand to her chest and felt the steady rhythm of decision. An unflashy, resolute thing. The presence had not been explained. It had been touched and negotiated with and catalogued. She had not run. Instead, she had fallen. Quietly, irrevocably, hopelessly perhaps in the way one falls for an idea that reorganizes life. The gray button in her pocket made a small clink when she shifted. It was a sound like punctuation. She breathed in cedar and closed her eyes, the city a soft smear beyond glass, and allowed for the being of a new language that mixed love with rules, tenderness with ledger, and presence with sovereignty. Morning light began to arrive as a thin thread through the blinds, and with it came the ledger on her knees, pages soft at the edges from nights of turning. Julia read across entries like someone reading the weather. Real 07, 0000, 1708, Silver Bloom, Tape 05, Rasp, P0.4 dB, Polaroid, 12, Tuft at edge, possible scale. The notations had become her map, and maps, she had learned, are never the thing itself. They are tools for getting there. That particular dawn proved restless. She had slept most of the night in fits, waking to the half-image of the appendage curling near the foot of the bed, the cedar-laden residue on her skin like punctuation. For a long time she lay with the gray button in an open palm, watching the brass lamp beyond the doorway make a slow arc of amber across the wood floor. Her chest tightened now and then, not with fear alone, but with the complexity of a decision that had refused resolution. Part of her understood the ledger as armor. Part of her new armor could become prison. She dressed slowly in a wool coat, slipping the gray button into an inner pocket as if it were an amulet. Outside, the city unfolded its small dramas, deliveries, umbrellas, the impatient politics of taxicabs. By noon, she would be at a luncheon arranged by an acquaintance whose table mattered for certain seasons of charity and patronage. The social calendar had become one of her instruments. To maintain a public life while tending the house's private pressure required an exactness of timing that she had not anticipated. At the luncheon, plates arrived like small, silent sculptures, and women in cream discussed art funds, as if money were a language they had mastered without losing their taste. Julia moved among them as she always had. A practiced ease in conversation, an eye for where a remark might curl into influence. All the while, her inner register kept the ledger's rhythm. Polaroid 12, developing tonight. Spool change tomorrow at 23 Aldak. Mirror check 107 degrees. It was a mechanical sort of devotion, and it allowed intimacy to exist as a protocol as much as an emotion. Billy arrived to greet her with an economy of gesture, a touch that was brief but sure. He smelled faintly of the cedar soaps he used in his coat pockets, and the contact felt less like a pledge than a continuation of an arrangement they had been negotiating for months. Outwardly, they presented the usual alloy of attraction and propriety. Inwardly, each touch was a measure in their private arithmetic of consent and boundary. When a table-mate asked, with the disarming cruelty of gossip, whether the cedar house had become a project rather than a home, Julia smiled and said nothing that would make the ledger an object of public scandal. Billy steered the conversation gently away, as he always did, and the luncheon dispersed into afternoon errands. Back at the house that evening, Kem arrived with new equipment and an unreadable optimism. He had a way of carrying small boxes like reliquaries, each one promising a better record. "We've got a new ribbon," he said, placing a flat coil on the table like an offering. "High grain, low noise. We'll run slow and then fast. See if it changes the waveform. They set up in the living room where the seam lived like an unspoken line across the floor. Kem affixed contact microphones under the legs of the sofa and threaded a hydrophonic pickup along the baseboard. He wired the devices to an analog recorder whose meters bobbed like the chest of a sleeping animal. Julia watched him move with the measured patience of someone who had once learned to value small skill over grand gestures. The spool turned. The room settled into the hush that comes with attempted witness. Julia felt the old urge, first to catalog, then to bargain with the night. She whispered the rules, the litany she had invented to keep the appendage within margins. Not the face, not the neck. No guests after midnight without protocol. Mirrors in place. Each clause lay into the house like a stitch. At 0:17:08, the recorder registered a shift. The meters quivered as if a stray breath had moved air. The analog channels showed a transient, an undercurrent like the scrape of something endowed with patient anatomy. When Kem slowed the tape and played it back at reduced speed, a sound emerged that could not be reduced to a single adjective. It was at once rasp and whisper, the noise of old wood learning to flex in a new rhythm. On the Super 8, in slow motion, the fabric of the seam wavered and the appendage, when the reel allowed a suggestion of motion, brushed the edge with a degree of precision that the eye registered as intentional. Afterward, in the quiet, Kem held up a small, nearly translucent sliver his fingers had scraped from the seam using a jeweler's blade. He set it on a piece of black paper. Under the reading glass, it caught light like a fish scale, a thin, laminated shimmer. Not human, he said at last, as if he had no other language for it. He did not explain. He did not need to. The object itself spoke with an unadorned clarity that the ledger had not yet been able to translate. Julia turned the sliver over with a pair of tweezers, feeling the particularity of its yield. A patterning that overlapped, compact and ordered, not feathered like a bird, nor ringed like a tree. It fit, in her hands, into a taxonomy of wonder that she kept folded and private. Label it, she said, deciding on the spot. Cedar box, date, real number. Kem nodded and did not ask how this would change anything in her life. He presumed only that knowledge must be kept in good order. Julia placed the sliver in a small envelope and pressed it into the cedar box along with the Polaroids and tapes. The box closed with a small, resonant click as though it agreed to keep its own counsel. Word, as words do in a city that trades on narrative, arrived in the form of hints. A blogger's post about an odd artifact being shown at a private viewing mentioned a curious fragment found by a host, and the internet's appetite stirred. The mention was half joke, half elegy. In the comments, speculation unfurled like threads. Julia watched the flurry and then closed the page. The ledger kept its own pace. Public curiosity did not scare her as much as it used to. Where once publicity might have tempted confession as a way to control narrative, now it suggested loss of governance. She had learned the cost of allowing the world to name what belonged to her. A week later, in a private moment of friction, she sat at her kitchen table with her mother on the line. The woman's voice still carried the bluntness of someone who understood that homemaking had economic terms. "Why do you keep it boxed in secrecy?" her mother asked. "If it's dangerous, why not remove yourself?" Julia listened to the question like a professional reads criticism. Careful, attentive, recording. She thought about the ledger and the cedar box and the small ceremony by which she reclaimed agency. "Because it's mine," she said finally, choosing a cadence that made the word both fact and decision. "Because I can catalog it and set terms. Leaving would mean someone else decides how to tell the story." Her mother sighed, soft enough that Julia could hear old habits of worry unspool. "Just be careful," she said. "Don't make a custom out of risk." She did not say anything else. She had learned that the ledger offered better comfort than pleas, and that rules could be more persuasive than rational argument. She hung up and set the phone down with fingers that had stopped trembling quite so often. Not all tests were purely observational. There came a night in which Julia elected to press forward with a deliberate experiment. She would present the button itself, small, gray, dull as a coin, as a negotiation tool. She wrapped it in a linen handkerchief and sat on the floor facing the seam, her knees close to her chest. The room smelled of cedar, lighter than before, because she had been careful with shavings. She turned the camera to analog, threaded the Super 8, and began to speak aloud as if recording a deposit to be heard by someone involved in the future. I give you the button. I make an exchange. You may touch only below the knee, only when I sit in this chair. You will not touch the face. The mechanical purr of the reel filled the room and made a steady rhythm against which the house hummed. She held the button on her palm and felt the weight of it. Time passed in the circular way analog devices measure it. Gradual, insistently reliable. When the appendage curled from the seam, it moved as if answering her invitation. It approached the offered hand with a deliberation that suggested recognition of the token. The pad of its tip, when it made contact with the linen, left not a mark so much as a pattern, a faint mosaic of scales that glimmered in the camera light. The Super 8, fed in slow motion later, showed the exchange as a motion of consent rather than conquest. The appendage's withdrawal matched her exhalation. That night, when she developed the Polaroid and threaded the tape, she found concordance. At 00:17:08, the frame held a silver bloom, and in the slightly overexposed edge, the motion of the appendage caught like a fingerprint. The audio recorded the softest rasp when it grazed the linen. She cataloged them together as a unit. Button exchange, 03, reel 09, 17S8F. The ledger grew thicker, and with each new page she felt less like someone under a strange spell, and more like an archivist stewarding a relationship that had required formalities. Billy's involvement, when it appeared, was complicated. He loved, in his ways, with the kind of attention reserved for the city's favors, a manner of giving that left the recipient visible to others. Sometimes he would attend a ritualized test with a polite curiosity. Other times he would bow out, claiming business, an appointment, an embarrassment too private for public explanation. There were evenings when he found it difficult to reconcile the appendage's reality with his need for social grace. Once, at a small dinner in the house with two mutual friends, he made a clumsy attempt to shield the subject from idle curiosity. "Let's not make it a parlor topic," he said, listening to the light clatter of cutlery. His face, in the lamplight, held a trace of fatigue. "I don't want it become a spectacle." Julia watched him and in that watchfulness catalogued a new parameter of their intimacy. Billy would protect her against scandal, but would do so within the limits of polite reticence. He was not, she realized, the kind of person who would make the appendage into a public cause. He would not create a campaign, would not turn the house into an exhibit. That, oddly, mattered to her. Part of choosing to stay had always been the desire to have someone who would anchor the world gently. His anchoring, however, came with its own reticence. There were nights when the appendage's curiosity translated into something that scraped along the edges of romance. Once, when she had come back late from a benefit, Billy met her at the door with a coat slung over his arm and a tenderness that read like the kind of reserve that had once comforted a younger Julia. He took her hand in a way that seemed to say he had accepted the ledger's terms, even if he did not understand all its notations. When they moved inside, the appendage, as if taking stock, explored the hem of her dress with a greenish glint that caught in the lamp. She felt it at the ankle and then along the calf, a curiosity that did not press to the face, as they had agreed. In the dim, she allowed herself something that could be called affection, a small unguarded laugh at the strangeness of her life. "I thought you might appreciate a chair by the seam," Billy said later, indicating the place where she usually sat for experiments. His voice was quiet. He had purchased a small upholstered stool and asked the upholsterer to create a repair that eliminated any sudden bulge while still allowing access to the seam when called upon. The gesture was thought out. It required a type of tenderness that in his world translated into commissions and careful phrasing. There were also nights when trust frayed. Once a guest, a man with a wily curiosity and a disposition for telling, slipped into the apartment after hours, ignoring the protocols that Julia and Billy had set. He meant only to see, to be part of whatever private oddity might make for a dinner table anecdote. In the kitchen later, the guest laughed, confident as a man accustomed to being entertained. He did not notice the seam's small shiver. Afterward, though no direct harm came of it, Julia sat with the ledger and wrote a new rule. Guests must sign protocol, no access without consent. She added an addendum, any breach, immediate removal of privileges. The rule read like a contract, and she sent it to Billy and he signed, electronically and with a real signature later over wine. More evidence accrued, and with it the sense that the appendage had rhythm. Patterns emerged. It appeared at certain hours, reached for certain fabrics, responded to cedar with an intensity that resembled hunger turned into vocabulary. The 17S8F moment, which had once been a private cadence, became a metrical anchor that recurred across artifacts. When a neighbor downstairs posted a rooftop photograph that captured, at that exact time code, a white square similar to the ones she had catalogued, Julia merely noted it and filed it away. The city's random collages of image and rumor mattered less than the pattern in her own hands. Time softened the initial shock that had once rippled her life. She found ways to love that were less theatrical and more architectural. She kept lists that had categories, behavioral, physical, protocol, and under them enumerated stipulations that made living with the presence not a horror, but a negotiated happening. She taught herself to translate feeling into practice. The law of the house, as she wrote it, felt in the end like an ethical system. Consent mediated in measured ways, protections for bodies, archives for memory. In one sense, she had built a small republic in which she was the single governor, and she liked that arrangement precisely because it allowed for nuance. There were moments when the appendage did something unexpectedly tender. Once, after a storm, the city hummed with the sort of dampness that made wood expand. Julia woke to find the appendage lying across the seam like a warm rope. It had brought a small gift, a flake of something like dried wood that gleamed with metallic sheen. She held it and felt under her thumb a coolness that was not inhospitable. For a time, she allowed herself to call whatever that act amounted to tenderness. "You're making a home of negotiation," Billy said once, watching her stack the cedar box with care. "It is a strange kind of domesticity." "It is a domesticity," she answered. "It is also governance." In the months that followed, there were professional obligations that tested her resolve. A magazine wanted an extended feature on the Cedar House that would make it even more of a public phenomenon. The piece would be elegant, curated, and profitable socially. The editor wanted a walkthrough and an essay on taste with a passing mention of the strange artifact she had found. Billy leaned toward acceptance, thinking of the city's appetite and the social capital such a story could yield. Julia refused. "No," she said simply. "Not now. Not like that." He looked at her with the mix of admiration and confusion that often accompanied his attempts to understand her choices. "Are you sure? We could control the narrative." "I'm sure," she said, thinking of the ledger and the cedar box, of small slivers gleaming under a reading glass. "Control is not the same as stewardship." He respected the refusal with the civilities he possessed, but she saw the small disappointment in him and catalogued that as well. Love, she had discovered, contains disappointment and a steadying, patient care that survives it. Proof accumulated in odd, analog ways. A Polaroid, taken in the dark after a night of protocol, developed to reveal a faint residue across the corner that, when examined under magnification, displayed an overlapping lamination not typical of any creature she'd seen. A strip of magnetic tape played through a low-speed deck emitted a complex waveform at the 17S8F mark that repeated with a variant pitch that Kem believed suggested an organic articulation. These were not the kind of findings that solved mythologies. They were small calligraphies of presence. Slowly, she began to formalize what she called the protocol, a short, precise manual she typed in her own hand and bound with a brass clip. It contained numbered sections and appendices. A. Rules of contact. B. Archival procedure. C. Guest policy. D. Emergency contacts. Chem, archivist, neighbor liaison. E. Cedar handling. Each clause carried dates and amendments. Under rules of contact, she wrote, face-off limits. Contact below the knee permitted only with token exchange. mirrors to be positioned as described in Appendix B. Under archival procedure, she specified film stock types, shutter speeds, and processing rituals to maximize analog fidelity. The protocol read like a domestic constitution. She printed 2 copies. One she kept inside the cedar box under a paperweight of polished stone, and the other she placed in a small, lockable drawer in her desk. On the spine of the binder, she had written with an artful hand, "Protocol for Presence, Calder Residence." It looked absurdly bureaucratic and at the same time deeply intimate. There was a peculiar evening in which the protocol itself was tested. An unexpected power outage swept the neighborhood, collapsing the city's crisp digital grid into a series of hushed lamps and candlelight. In the dark, without the steady hum of electronics, the house felt older and more immediate. Julia lit a candle, placed the button on the table between them, and sat facing the seam with Billy on the sofa. They spoke in the kind of slow sentences that people use when they want to be careful with one another. "If this gets out," he said quietly, "it will change you in ways I'm not ready to name." "It will always change me," she answered. "It already has." When the appendage moved, it did so as though the world had reduced to essentials. It approached the candlelight, and the lamp of cedar seemed to feed it some strange electricity. For a moment, its shadow laid across the wall like a smudge of unnameable scale. The room felt very small and very blessed in the way that private things feel when they are held between 2 people who understand the weight of discretion. After the outage, when power returned and the city's electric voice resumed, Julia opened a page of the protocol and wrote an amendment. In case of unexpected public exposure, maintain analog artifacts, consult chem, enforce guest removal, do not engage with press. The amendment was a small insistence of autonomy. There were times when the city's language, its quick appetites and appetite for mystery, tempted her to monetize or to dramatize. Yet she refused these temptations with a kind of stubborn grace. She had become someone who chooses the hard architecture of living rather than the gold rush of publicity. The ledger and the cedar box were not just for proof. They were portals to a way of living that she had designed to protect the shape of her days. Months lengthened into a year, and the sequence of rituals recalibrated her life. Friends learned slowly how to behave inside her apartment. Shoes off by the door, no abrupt movement across the seam, the hush of voices when the analog equipment ran. Billy accompanied her at many of these private tests, and, over time, his handshake and small domestic ministrations folded into this life with a gentle consistency that both strengthened and complicated their intimacy. He would bring cedar-scented soaps, make appointments for fabric repair, or, when she insisted, sit through a reel and listen to the rasp and say nothing more than a measured, "noted." It was not a grand romance. It was a practice of steady attention. There were moments of rapture that were not dramatic. Once, in late winter, the appendage curled at the base of the sofa and pressed a small pad of contact against the hem of her coat. The sensation was at once benign and charged, an exchange of temperature, a brief pressure that left a faint pattern. Afterward, she found, inside her pocket, clutched with her gloved hand, a tiny scale, no larger than a fingernail, dusted with cedar residue. She held it under the reading glass and felt, briefly, a queasy sort of wonder. He wasn't human, she thought suddenly, and with a kind of finality. The thought came as an inward admission rather than an outside proclamation. It felt like naming rather than judging. She did not explain it aloud. She did not have to. The cedar-boxed artifacts had already done a certain public work of evidence for the small circle that mattered. The knowledge that the presence was not human reframed the ledger in a single, sharp way. This was not merely a stranger who had entered her home. It was another species of presence to be stewarded with laws. The alphabet of negotiation changed with that description. She put the scale in a sealed vial, wrote its code on the inside of the lid, scale 01, and slid it into the cedar box next to the sliver and Polaroids. The box took the items like a repository of commandments. In the months that followed, she worked to codify care. She wrote in a small, careful script at the front of the protocol a sentence that felt like a vow. "I will not allow novelty to become spectacle. I will not allow fear to unmake what I have built. The sentence read like a moral anchor, and in saying it she fashioned for herself the kind of daily courage that small rules can generate. There were late-night conversations with Billy that approached confession without fully arriving there. "Do you ever wonder if it's lonely?" he asked once, watching the reel flicker. "To be alone in a body so different?" "I suppose," she said. "But loneliness is often a human assumption. Maybe it has other kinds of company we can't see." He smiled at her in the precise, public way he had. "You're always 20% philosophical and 80% logistical," he observed. "That ratio serves me," she replied. There was a softness in his voice that made all the calendars and obligations seem smaller for a moment. He had his own ways of giving, concrete and understated. A gift of a chair, a paid conservation for the tapes, the way he would arrange for Kem's visits without fuss. He did not demand explanations, he accepted the rules. His acceptance mattered to her because it was an action, not merely a sentiment. Over time, the protocol became less an act of defense than an art form. She found, in arranging mirrors and lamps and cedar shavings, the same pleasure she had once derived from curating exhibitions or planning dinners. The domestic practices took on an aesthetic dimension. A mirror at an angle became not just surveillance, but a study in light. A lamp's warmth became a measure in which life proceeded. The presence, for its part, continued to respond in ways that were seemingly attuned to those measures. It followed her rituals and, with patient intelligence, found its own contours. A winter afternoon, mid-year, offered a small test of their arrangements. A television crew asked for an interview. They wanted a tasteful piece on modern interiors, and were prepared to overlook or to mention the cedar house as an aside. Julia said no. A magazine attempted to place a profile. She refused. She had learned the cost of spectacle. A world curious for novelty ate privacy and left residue. She preferred to guard the ledger and the cedar box for those who would understand the language without turning it into a narrative-devouring machine. In the years that followed, years measured by real changes and Polaroid numbers, by amendments to the protocol, Julia settled into a life that was at once social and secret. She hosted parties shaped by rules, a soft hour for conversation, and a private protocol session later, where select friends could lecture on the ethics of strange presences. She moved through galleries and luncheons, elbows scraped in polite intimacy, and at night returned to the house where the seam had learned to be companionable. The appendage continued to present itself as if mastering a language of careful contact. It brushed her ankle in the morning, left a faint residue on the sleeve in which she kept the gray button, and sometimes, in the long watches of the night, curled into a near embrace that never touched the face. People continued to speculate. Some thought of her house as eccentric, others saw it as avant-garde. For the city's chroniclers, she was a figure who had turned the extraordinary into a chic accessory, which was a benign misreading that protected her in some small way. The cedar house became an item of gossip, and then an item of nostalgia. A story people would recall when asked about the peculiarities of an artful life. She allowed the world its small stories so long as they did not consume the ledger's careful particulars. The ledger thickened with time and with tenderness. At the front of the cedar box, she kept a small photograph, not of publicity, but of a private moment. Billy, at the kitchen table, sleeves rolled, looking up as if to ask permission to be part of the experiment. He had his unadorned kindness in that image, and beside it, a Polaroid showing the seam with a faint silver where the appendage had touched. The objects read like a marriage certificate of sorts, not between two people in the conventional sense, but between a woman, the city's life she had built, and a presence that required her care. She did not romanticize the presence. There were nights in which its curiosity unsettled her, and other nights where the ledger's discipline felt insufficient to contain her anxieties. There were also evenings of surprising grace when she laughed with friends about the absurdities of being the owner of a cedar shrine. In all those permutations, she kept insisting on one principle. She would not be defined by what the city would say she had found. She would define how to live with what lived in her house. When she told herself the plain truth in private, spoken aloud only once, late at night when the house was a slow instrument of hush, she said, "I should have run. I should have gone." The sentence sat heavy and true. She looked at the cedar box, the gray button sitting on the lid like a small moon, and then closed the lid slowly. "But I didn't," she said to the empty room, and the phrase landed like a soft, irrevocable bell. "I stayed." He wasn't human, she admitted finally in the privacy of her own head, not as an accusation, but as a factual arrangement that changed the terms of everything. That naming did not make the appendage monstrous or neatly explainable. It merely oriented her. Knowing that it was not human allowed her to write rules that respected difference rather than to address it with human assumptions. The ledger and the protocol were the practical love letters she wrote to a life that would not be otherwise ordinary. In the end, her life became a series of small ordinances and quiet joys. She continued to attend the city's luncheons and galleries, to be photographed, to appear in curated spreads that emphasized tasteful restraint. She continued to host, to laugh, to hold the hand of a friend whose pain she could ease with a measure of her attention. At night she tended the cedar box and the reels and sat sometimes with Billy while the Super 8 clicked, their shared watch attenuating the foreignness into something intimately lived. The last image of the year, her small private coda, fell into a calm morning when snow dusted the city with a rare hush. She buttoned her coat, the gray button tucked safely in an inner pocket. Billy kissed her gently at the door and said what he often said in variations. "Come home to me." "I will," she answered, thinking of the ledger and the house and the presence that had taught her to make rules into tenderness. She stepped into the street where the city kept moving, indifferent and blunt and bright. People recognized her and smiled. Cameras found her in a quick flash, and the image took a flatness that never contained the seam. When she returned that evening, the cedar box waited with its familiar click. She undid the clasp and reached inside for the vial containing the tiny scale. She held it in her hand and for a long moment looked at its lamination, its small economy of overlap. He wasn't human, she thought once more, and the thought no longer conflicted with her affection. The two things could coexist, an absence of shared species and the sustaining proximity of choices that stitch a life. She set the vial back, closed the cedar box, and rose to the mirror arranged at the exact angle that caught the seam's edge. Her reflection looked like any other woman's adapting to an odd life, hair arranged, coat buttoned, the set of someone who had built a life on both constancy and concession. She placed the gray button over her heart for a second, a private ritual she had learned to practice when decisions had to be reaffirmed. Then she walked to the sofa and sat where she had always sat for experiments. The seam was quiet. From somewhere beneath the upholstery, a small movement, measured and familiar, made itself known. The appendage brushed the underside of the sofa as if making an inventory, then rose just enough to rest along her ankle with the courtesy of a neighbor's greeting. It did not touch the face. It left no mark. It left only the cedar-scented residue and the feeling of a presence that had its own terms of engagement. She smiled without cynicism. She had not been naive. She had not capitulated. She had chosen, in the hard and certain way of persons who intend to govern their own lives, to remain. The house, the ledger, the cedar box, the gray button, these were instruments of sovereignty, instruments of love. Outside, somewhere beyond glass, city life continued to produce small and large dramas. Inside, the house exhaled cedar. The reed of the reel rested in its slot, the Polaroid lay warm under a towel, and the binder labeled Protocol for Presence waited on the desk like law. She ran her fingers over its edge and felt, in the small scratch of paper, the texture of a life she had chosen. If anyone ever asked her whether she had made the right choice, she would likely give a careful answer that combined fact and feeling. For now, she held the gray button between her thumb and forefinger and kept a modest, private oath. She had every reason to leave, opportunity, wealth, an easy exodus from the uncanny, but she had not chosen that route. Instead, she had turned wonder into practice, fear into procedure, and the otherness beneath her sofa into a companion that required rules rather than conquest. He wasn't human. He smelled of cedar and left scale smatterings in the folds of fabric, and he learned to avoid the face as if honoring a covenant. He remained an inscrutable presence and, in that inscrutability, provided a kind of stability. Julia, for her part, became the sort of person who could make a house into a grammar of living, lists, mirrors, lamps, a cedar box, a single gray button held in an inner pocket. She carried the button like punctuation, like a private heart. The city would continue to write what it wanted about her. Photographers would catch the angle of her cheek at a gala. Columnists would rehearse their opinions on her choices. She would smile into flashes and then return to the cedar house where the ledger expanded gently each night. There, in the soft and careful rooms, she would sit by the lamp and watch the seam, counting seconds, watching analog slow motion, noting a rasp, filing a Polaroid. It was not the life she had imagined as a younger woman who loved being seen, but it was a life she had chosen, and choosing had become its own form of love. She pressed the gray button into her palm once more, and, as if to certify a ritual, tucked it back into the inner pocket where only she could feel it. The appendage shifted in the seam and sent a tiny gust of cedar scent through the room. Julia breathed it in, not with surrender, but with a measured gratitude. The presence was still there. The cedar was still on the air. The ledger lay closed on the table like a book of laws and consolations. If she had run away, she would have absolved herself of complication. Instead, she had learned the labor of intimacy in another form, an intimacy that required rules, artifacts, attention, and the courage to remain. He wasn't human, and that was the fact that reorganized her world into a new geometry. She stepped from the lamp's glow into the darker ring of the room, and there, with cedar on the air and the gray button warm near her chest, she returned the house to itself. The city kept spinning, sharp and bright. Inside, she had fashioned a life that held both love and method, and in that holding she found at last a steady kind of peace. If this story held a shape, it was not the shape of final revelation. It was instead the shape of a life arranged around mystery, a ledger, a box, a button, and a set of rules that articulated consent and care. She had not run. She had instead fallen, hopelessly perhaps, into a tenderness that was complicated and sovereign. That tenderness taught her daily how to live. If you enjoyed this slow unraveling tale of taste, ritual, and otherness, subscribe for more stories where the ordinary contains its own secrets.